I'm Al McFarlane. Welcome to The Conversation with Al McFarlane. Today is Thursday, the February 16th, 2023. Again, glad to be here and glad to have you along. Let me begin by asking you to support this conversation, support the idea and the platform we're creating to create robust conversations, our people talking to our people into the world about things that we care about. And the way I want you to do that is very specific. We want to sort of build our community around the Insight YouTube channel. And so I want you to, if you're able or willing, and if you can share this with your friends and your contacts, go to YouTube and click on the Insight News channel. You'll find this program. Subscribe, like, and share. Subscribe, like, and share. And, my idea is that we're going to build this channel viewer by viewer, person by person. So I'm asking you, dear viewer, dear friend, dear sister and brother, to do your part to help build this conversation, this program. Go to YouTube, Insight News channel, subscribe, like, and share. Well, today we typically have just friends. I call the friends group companions, who are people committed to moving in a direction. The direction is towards the actualization of both ourselves, our communities, our families, of all of the living things in the planet in a way that's organic, that's consistent, and that values every element and aspect of existence in its own right. That's a big order. It's a tall order, but I think that's what friends can do and should do. The principle is, how do we share knowledge? How do we keep inventing knowledge? And how do we move in ways that really respect and embellish and allow us to build on each other without extracting or exploiting each other, or without exploiting the environment, without exploiting the resources of the planet? How is this spirit and possibility of cooperation and collaboration and equity, how does that emerge? Well, we're on that path together, and I'm thankful for having this opportunity to be with these friends. Today's program, we usually have hot topics. I'm going to just list, though, a number of things we'll be talking about over the course of the program. One of the ideas we're going to come up with is looking at how do formerly incarcerated individuals reclaim their lives, particularly after they've been falsely accused, falsely imprisoned, and finally released. We want to also examine the idea of children being tried as adults. And then going down the same vein, should felons who are on probation be able to vote in Minnesota? Interesting developments in that area. Finally, our topic will be discussing the $20 million investment to ease the childcare shortage. What's the impact of that in our community? At the end of today's program, I'm going to ask our book review editor, Brother W.D. Foster Graham, to review a current book. It'll be great to have this information. And we were saying before camera how important it is for us to talk about reading, talk about books, talk about newspapers, and to keep this idea of the value of learning, of acquiring knowledge through reading, again, front and center in our community. So let me begin. Again, thank you all for being here. Go to YouTube, Insight News, subscribe, like, and share. Well, our first topic is on the question of how formerly incarcerated individuals reclaim their lives after being falsely accused, imprisoned, and finally released. Well, there's a story I have about a Missouri man who served 27 years in prison and was just released. The story I'm going to share with you, and then we'll talk about that, is from a CNN report. The headline says, "Missouri man who served 27 years in prison is freed as judge vacates his murder conviction." And the story, I'll just read a part of it, and then we'll react to it and respond to it as a group. Says a Missouri man who has been serving a life sentence for nearly 3 decades was set free on Tuesday, I believe, after a judge ruled he is innocent and vacated his murder conviction. Lamar Johnson was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole in 1995 after being convicted of murder in the death of Marcus Boyd the year prior. At the time, police said Johnson and another man, Philip Campbell, shot and killed Boyd. But Johnson was given a new hearing after St. Louis Circuit Attorney Kimberly Gardner filed a motion last year saying his conviction was based in large part on false eyewitness testimony and accusing prosecutors and investigators of misconduct. Well, Tuesday, the Missouri Circuit Court Judge David Mason ruled that Johnson's trial included constitutional error and said there is clear and convincing evidence of Lamar Johnson's actual innocence, according to the judge's order. Well, I'll stop there and have welcome in my guest today, Brother Yusuf Ndugu. Yusuf Mjini is here. Brother Yusuf, how you doing? And our dear sister Angela Rose Myers is here. Angela, how are you doing? And of course, I mentioned him, but here he is again, W.D. Foster Graham. Hello, team. How's everybody?
Good. Thank you. Good to be with you.
Well, let's go to you first, Yusuf, just to weigh in on the question of a guy serving 27 years in prison and being released. How terrible is that, number one? And what should happen? What should happen in his life now?
Well, three things now. First, he wasn't pardoned. He was exonerated because the witness who identified his photo from a lineup acknowledged that he had no idea what the man who committed the murder looked like and was pressured by the police to identify this brother who went to prison for 29 years. And in Missouri, unfortunately, state law says the only time an innocent person who is sent to prison is compensated is when DNA evidence proves their innocence. So after 29 years in prison, his conviction was exonerated, wiped off the books, and he gets out of prison penniless after 29 years in prison. So hopefully he'll get a good attorney and be able to do something about that. I've volunteered in the prisons in Minnesota, men's, women's, juvenile, and I grew up with a brother who went to Stillwater State Prison, served 7 years for a crime that he did not commit. And long after the person who did commit the crime confessed, he was told that the only way he could get out of jail was if he signed a statement indicating that he would not sue the state of Minnesota or the Department of Corrections after 7 years of his life had basically gone down the drain. And believe me, there's nothing harder than for a person who's been in the carceral system to try and get back on their feet, reestablish themselves, their credit, employment. When you apply for a job and you've got a 3, 5, 7, 10-year gap in terms of employment, chances aren't very good that you're going to get hired. And many of the programs, the skill programs, the educational programs, the degree programs that did exist in the prisons have gone the way of the budget cuts. So it's Angela, a very tough issue.
Angela, jump in. What's your impression of the story, the problem, and what kinds of remedies or solutions? What does it say about the corrections system in our country that so many of our people languish, charged, convicted unfairly, and even when they discover that the system has failed them, there's difficulty in them getting to justice? What do you think?
No, I definitely agree. I wonder around the civil suits that you do see is that sometimes folks will sign away their rights to sue a prosecutor, even if there is like misconduct. But to your question of what is the problem here is also there's a problem of prosecutors, right? Of prosecutorial misconduct, where time and time again, how many times have we heard somebody took a deal to lie on somebody else? they took something, they maybe got funds, or they were coerced, or they were pressured into lying in order to frame and to set up someone else. And there are prosecutors, police officers, and other, agents of the criminal legal system that benefit from manipulation of regular day folk, economic manipulation, or manipulation of saying, well, we'll get you out faster, or you'll have immunity on this thing if you say that XYZ person did it. And that's what we saw even with Mayan Burrell. And Mayan was not exonerated. He was pardoned by the pardon board here in Minnesota, but he was someone else who was an innocent man who was put away for murder, who recently got out in 2021.
W.D. Foster Graham, good afternoon, brother. How are you doing, man?
Good to be here.
Weigh in on the topic. What are your thoughts?
Well, my thoughts was when I heard it, I thought, hey, that could have been me 40 years ago, because I was picked up by the police and had all kinds of rifles pointed at me saying I committed aggravated robbery. And I was 28 years old, didn't know what was going on. Turns out there was never a crime in the first place, because the woman who said I robbed her actually gave her money to her boyfriend and just pointed me out because I happened to be walking by and I had a distinctive look. So I think about, I didn't do it then, but I thought about, okay, a lawsuit here. I didn't find out about this until much later, when my dad told me. And of course, police wanted me to, cop to this crime that I didn't commit, and
that never took place, right? It didn't even happen.
It never happened. And so they tried to lean on my dad to say, okay, you try to talk to him, convince him to confess. And my dad said, well, let me just say this. Dad said in very nice words to shove it. But because I could prove where I was, they had to let me go after that night, but that one night was enough. So I get where after 27 years, that's injustice on a grand scale.
Let me pivot to the next topic. The next topic will be about the fatal stabbing at Harding High School. There's an article I have from Twin Cities Pioneer Press, and I think it's today's paper, today's online edition. The headline says, "Teen charged in fatal stabbing at Harding. Prosecutors seek adult certification." And briefly, I'll give the background of the story. It says that a 16-year-old Harding student was charged Tuesday in last week's stabbing death of fellow student Devin Donnell Edward Scott in a hallway in the St. Paul High School. It was Scott's first day at the East Side School. He was 15, a sophomore. A juvenile petition charging Nosakari Kazim Holmes with second-degree murder describes a hallway fight between him and Scott, with the assistant principal and another school staffer trying to break it up. A third student then jumped in the fight and threw blows at Holmes, who stabbed Scott in the chest and abdomen. Holmes began attending Harding at the start of the school year. The third student, who was not identified in the petition, has been attending Harding for approximately a week. The Ramsey County Attorney's Office is seeking to have Holmes certified as an adult. That's your territory over there in St. Paul, Brother Youssef. What else can you tell us about what's happening in that case and what the community's reactions are to it?
Well, the person who did the stabbing is claiming self-defense because he was involved in a fight with two individuals. And just prior to the outbreak of COVID, the Board of Education in St. Paul voted to eliminate the school resource officers who were licensed sworn police officers from the schools and began training their own security staff within the public school district. This incident occurred in the school. And now the superintendent has announced that he is sending 2 police officers to Harding, Como, Central, and Humboldt high schools that have a large percentage of young students of color. This was a tragic incident for everybody involved because the county attorney, John Choi, is attempting to charge the juvenile with the knife as an adult, which increases the likelihood of incarceration. These kids are going to prison younger and younger for longer and longer. And there's been a series of violent incidents involving guns, knives, and physical fights in the public schools over the period of time since the schools reopened following COVID. And there's a lot of discussion taking place in the community with parents. Unfortunately, I haven't heard a lot about these discussions inviting or engaging young people themselves. And I think until they become a part of the discussion, they're not going to have any investment or ownership in any of the solutions that are proposed.
Angela, how would that look? How would involving young people in this discussion? I mean, to me, it segues into the work you've been doing in questioning or challenging or promoting the rethinking of what public safety is, what it means, what justice looks like, and how the entire apparatus needs to be sort of reconfigured. Am I right in pointing in that direction to you, Angela?
Yes, no, 100%. I mean, my heart goes out to that family and to all of the families of the young individuals who are involved. And, there is something of an emotional mental health component that I really question of, how does a fight break out in a school that then leads to a stabbing? And the work that I do is around restorative justice, and there are a number of youth-based organizations or organizations that are looking to end the juvenile justice incarceration system and to do more restorative juvenile justice, which focuses on the health of the individual and the community. So really making sure that young men, young women, young folk are built up in a way where they wouldn't even be getting into these fights to begin with. How do these fights start? They start with, a snide remark, a look, things like that, and it just escalates. So how can we work on really building confidence, building mental health capacities in these schools and de-escalation so that these young folk are not, fighting. And then on the other end with the restorative aspect, then how can we make sure that this young person can be reintegrated into the community, take accountability for their actions, and that the other folk who are impacted also see them as a human being, not as a villain, not as a criminal, but rather as a human being who made a mistake. And how can we get there together as a community without throwing young men, young children away into our criminal justice system?
WD, what do you say about this?
Well, it's a complex situation. Of course, when I grew up, normally if you had some issues you had to settle, normally you have to settle out of school, away from school and playground, you might duke it out. However, that's not the case anymore. I think this has escalated. So, Sister Angela, I agree with you on that what's necessary is to take that proactive approach before it ever gets to that point. And that starts with raising the community, having that sense of identity and stuff. And just remind people, no, there are better ways to solve an issue or disagreements, that sort of thing, before it gets to that point. And of course, once it's there, then it's reactive and it's damage control. So my take is get on the proactive side. I'm not saying that the person who committed the crime won't have consequences, but it will be something that we need to do on the front end versus the back end.
Definitely.
Mike V, who's a frequent visitor to the program. Mike, thank you so much for weighing in and raising questions and making comments. You ask what systems or processes are in place to deter weapons on our school campuses. Angela, yourself, anybody?
You see, some schools, they employ, the security, the metal detectors. You've seen even across the country, the see-through backpacks. But these are, very practical kind of policies that are kind of work around the edges. But the real question is, why do students feel like they need to bring weapons to school? They feel like they need to bring weapons to school because they feel unsafe at school. I was working with a young student who her brother was, wrapped up in that life, and she was targeted to the point where she stopped going to school because the, folks who were targeting her brother had left the school as well. They were waiting for her. They couldn't find a brother, but they knew she would be at school every day. And this was a young woman who was incredibly intelligent, but she felt unsafe at school. So she made the option to not go anymore. And unfortunately, this is this is the outcomes of a lot of community violence, a lot of issues within our community now around safety, around, the organized crime, cliques, gangs, whatever you want to call them. And, we do need to focus on how to rebuild a healthier community around well-being. So students in the first point don't feel so unsafe that they need to bring weapons to school.
I'm going to switch a little bit again. I've got an article pulled up, and I'll start back with you, Angela. The article says that Minnesota Supreme Court rules felons cannot vote on probation under the current state law. And this was a report posted on Care 11 today. And it says the Minnesota Supreme Court has upheld the state's ban on felons voting while serving probation, ruling that the ban does not violate equal protection provisions in the Minnesota Constitution. The decision came as the DFL majority in the state legislature is pushing for a felon voting rights measure, which has already been passed by the Minnesota House. According to the Minnesota Constitution, a person is ineligible to vote if they have been convicted of treason or felony unless restored to civil rights. Current state law says those civil rights can be restored, including the right to vote, upon the discharge of their conviction. However, the Supreme Court's ruling says that doesn't mean a felon's voting rights are immediately restored upon leaving prison, but rather upon completion of the full sentence, such as serving the probation and supervised release. What do you think about that, Angela? And what is the movement, the community doing to support what we call reform in the justice and prison system?
Let me rephrase this also so folks in the community know what we're talking about. So currently right now, if you had a felony conviction but you are off paper, so you have served your probation, you served your off paper, right, you are allowed to vote in Minnesota. What we're talking about is that that period of time, right, where you are still serving out your sentence, but you are not incarcerated, right? You are, you're not really fully you're not really fully serving out your sentence. Like, you've been punished, but this is just this level of reintegration into the community where felons do not, or former people who have been convicted of felonies don't have the full representation that they would like. And so also the second point is that our representatives in the Minnesota House and Senate have already voted on this issue. They have voted that you should be allowed if you're a felon on paper, right? But you are not incarcerated, not in the prison system right now. Like, you should be allowed to vote. And so who do we know? What group of people do we know who are still kind of in that space? And it's mainly a lot of Black men. In Minnesota, actually, over the last couple of decades, we have decreased our Black male population for when it comes to physical folks incarcerated, increased women, but decrease in the male numbers a little bit. But we have actually lengthened the time that people are on paper, where people can be, on paper. You can't, you have to keep living in maybe like Hennepin County, Ramsey County. You can't leave the state, can't leave, the country, still have to check in with your PO, things like that. And that could be for decades. So over time, this is something that's uniquely also Minnesotan, as there's been a real increase of people in this space, and they're mainly Black and brown men in particular, women as well, can be in this space. And so it seems it's starting to get unfair, right? We're starting to say, maybe this is a situation where this could, and we're already seeing the racial inequalities here, but maybe this is a specific policy that we can change to make sure that more Black folk can vote, less voter disenfranchisement in this state. And this is a particular restore the vote bill that would lessen voter disenfranchisement, particularly for Black and brown men. Yeah.
Yusuf, jump in.
Well, Al, each state has its own laws on disenfranchisement that range from allowing people with felony convictions to vote while they're in prison to restoring voting rights after the completion of some or all of the sentence to banning former felons from voting permanently. Nationally, this affected more than 11 million people in 2016 and more than 50,000 people in Minnesota today. Now, the research has demonstrated that after people who have completed their sentence in terms of the penalty for the crimes for which they've been convicted are allowed back into society fully and are allowed to vote, they can more fully integrate into society and are less likely to return to prison. The other issue is that prison jurisdictions are paying for services for people who are incarcerated, and they should be compensated by counting the prisoners as residents on the census. Because again, as Angela said, this affects poor people and people of color disproportionately. And we are not one of the 21 states that does allow ex-felons the right to vote. Now, what the Supreme Court did was simply state it is not unconstitutional in Minnesota to prohibit ex-felons from voting, which basically kicks the can right back into the legislature, and that's where this battle is going to have to be waged.
WD, any thoughts or comments on this topic?
Well, my thoughts are consistent with Angela and Yusef on this item because, yeah, if you're on probation, you are in essence in limbo. And two, because it's disproportionate in terms of Black and brown, my thing is I see no reason why they can't vote, because when you say you vote, you're more likely to say, hey, I'm a part of this. And something that was mentioned prior to the show about the census and the way some towns are counting persons who are incarcerated in their jurisdictions versus the felon, in this case, their own jurisdictions. So there's a political spin on this. And so now I would say now it's back to the legislature on that. Yeah, I still see it that the prisoners, or say the persons who are felons, should be able to vote.
You know, what if, Angela, we came up with an ideation, a rethinking, where we use the privilege and responsibility to vote as one of the rehabilitation tools, that we lead with the idea that in order to complete your sentence or service, you have to register and you have to vote. That may be radical, but I think that there's another way to look at the entire thing that is not punitive, but uses the strategy as a teaching, learning, and engagement resource that could be of benefit to everybody who is incarcerated presently, who is a felon. Use that as a tool to induce and invite and support that person's reentry into community. What do you think, Angela?
I think that, that is always an option if we vote so, and I think that is what we really, should be looking into, is ways that we can support folks of engaging in our community and not stripping of their rights, and going from punitive mindsets to, maybe we do want more folks to be involved, especially in our right now, as so many folks do not know how our legal system works, our criminal justice system works, how our, the elective system works. But, really engaging folk on that is super important. I agree.
Well, let's move the discussion one more time. It's in the same vein, though. You've all seen the story of the white supremacist who was sentenced to life in prison. I've got a story pulled up, I think, out of Insight this week, and headline. It's a story by the Associated Press, written by Carolyn Thompson and Jennifer Peltz, I think. The headline is "White Supremacist Gets Life in Prison for Buffalo Massacre." And if you all recall, I'll share the beginning of the story. Dateline, Buffalo, New York. A white supremacist who killed 10 Black people at a Buffalo supermarket was sentenced to life in prison without parole Wednesday after relatives of his victims confronted him with pain and rage caused by his racist attack. Anger briefly turned physical at Peyton Gendron's sentencing when a victim's family member rushed him from the audience. The man was quickly restrained. Prosecutors later said he wouldn't be charged. The proceeding then resumed with an emotional outpouring of people who lost loved ones or were themselves wounded in the attack. Gendron, whose hatred was fueled by racist conspiracy theories he encountered online, cried during some of the testimony and apologized to victims and their families in a brief statement. Their remarks ranged from sorrow to outrage, shouts to tears. Some vehemently condemned him. Others quoted from the Bible or saying they were praying for him. Several pointed out that he deliberately attacked a Black community a 3-hour drive from his home in overwhelmingly white Conklin, New York. And one of the people that testified, the son of victim Celestine Cheney, said, "You've been brainwashed," and told him, "You don't even know Black people that much to hate them. You've learned this on the internet." What do you guys think? WD, I'll start with you. Have you watched and covered the story or followed the story at all? And if you have, what's your impressions, your thoughts?
Well, I hadn't found out that much about it, prior to today. But it reminds me of the thing that, hey, like, children didn't come into this world hating; they had to be taught to hate at some point in time. So when it comes to these, it seems like this is not the first time this has happened. And my feeling is it's not going to be the last. But until you get to the roots of it, these things will keep on happening.
Yusuf, what do you think?
Well, Al, these events have three things in common. Number one, a disproportionate number of people engaged in these mass shootings or targeted shootings in communities of color are people with a history of mental health issues, depression, stress, and there need to be red flag laws that either temporarily or permanently deny these people access to that. Number two, these people are frequently indoctrinated or miseducated on these white racist websites or by participation in these white racist groups, and just want to go out and try and start a race war, which is the motivation for many of them. If they can start Black and white folks shooting at each other, that it will escalate into a race war and result in dividing the country even further than it is, not just politically, but geographically. The third point is that until we start dealing with background checks and straw purchases of handguns that are then sold illegally to people who are not eligible to own or carry a firearm, we're going to continue to have these types of incidents. And we were talking earlier about the fact that we've had 67 mass shootings in the first 45 days of 2023. And a mass shooting is defined in one in which 4 or more people are killed or critically injured. And at some point, enough has got to be enough. And I think we're beyond enough. And we really need to buckle down and start judging the people that we elect to political office based on what their positions are on these kinds of life-saving or life-taking issues.
Angela, thoughts?
Yes. No, I mean, I remember in like 2020 when there was the uprising of George Floyd after George Floyd's murder, and Leslie and I were going out, and we had seen, I wasn't really on the streets like that. I was handling a lot of the organizational aspects of protecting Black businesses during the uprising. But the one day that I did go out, there were pickup trucks of white guys with Confederate flags on the trucks. And when I had went in front of this state committee on public safety, and I had said, like, we saw white supremacists out during the uprising. I remember the pushback that I had gotten from white Minnesotans saying that, white supremacists aren't real. Well, here we have, and this was, also like right in the time of like January 6th, 2021. And so now we have evidence. January 6th, 2021, we have now just more and more and more evidence that white supremacists are real. Listen to Black folk when they talk about it, because we've seen them. They're out here. They are organized. These are not, one-off folk. They are organized. They have oath keepers. They have lists. They have Proud Boys. They are organized. They're politically motivated to do this violence, right? And they are politically wanting to go out and start a race war, as Mr. Mjeni said, and they're brainwashed. At some point, we do have to ask the websites that they're on, are they responsible in some capacity for this violence too? Because these websites are companies. These are companies that are getting paid off of the engagement, the racist, hate-filled engagement and hate speech that are on their websites through advertisement. So, at what point do we also want to target the websites, these companies that are breeding hate? We do, of course, the gun law issue in the US has been, going on for decades, and we've yet to really see it on the Black community organizing space to push any real gun laws. So when is it going to be just like Americans come together? I mean, I read recently someone had said that the gun law debate effectively ended with the Parkland murder. And, Parkland was just this past, the anniversary of Parkland happened just this past week. And people said, what do you mean? What do you mean? When we have effectively allowed a murder of young, high school students to happen, a mass murder of young high school students to happen, and yet no meaningful gun laws come out after that, then we've lost the gun laws debate. It's been a debate that has, lost momentum, and with every passing mass shooting is only getting weaker and weaker. Now we also have to rethink, what do we need to do in our society to stop violence, to actually reinvigorate this gun laws and gun policies, and address who's truly responsible.
Mike V, shout out to you again. Your comments too. I want to share the more recent one regards this topic. It says that as someone who works in cybersecurity and threat intelligence, we need more effective laws that allow us to perform a forensic analysis on the person's social media history to understand the suitability for gun ownership. What do you think about that, Youssef? We have this debate about the Second Amendment and the right to bear arms, but the question is who should be allowed to have arms. And what we're discovering is that the policies that exist right now are policies that allow, as you said, over 60 mass shootings in the first 45 days of this year.
67. Yeah. Well, Al, when you can go to a swap meet or an armory or a flea market and buy a gun simply because you have cash, with no background check, with no evidence that you're qualified and trained in how to safely handle a firearm, no review of the laws and the criteria that are necessary in order to obtain a concealed carry permit or even to purchase a weapon, we're going to continue to have these random acts of violence. And again, background checks, straw purchases, and emotional and mental stability in order to obtain a permit to purchase a gun. And until we have universal background checks, people are going to crisscross state lines. They're going to go to swap meets instead of to FFL gun licensing locations or businesses. And we're going to continue to have all these illegal guns. Most of the guns used in crime are the result of burglary because people who own guns aren't safely locking or securing or preventing people from having easy access to them when they go to church. Or, a lot of people read the obituaries, find out when a funeral is going to happen, and break in Grandma Johnson's house and steal Grandpa Johnson's guns. And then they wind up on the street or with kids or being sold under the counter or in the underground economy. And it's gone too far. We've got to do something about it.
I would say back to the question that was asked is that unfortunately, I see something like the forensic analysis that your viewer brought up being used against the Black community more than white supremacists. And that's what we've seen in Minneapolis with the history of just this past year, 2022, the Minnesota Department of Human Rights came out and said that, the Minneapolis Police Department was doing, a sort of forensic analysis of creating blackface, of social media pages and following the Minneapolis NAACP, the Urban League, folks like myself and other, Black leaders. And, essentially tracking us, showing up where we would be if we had any events, things like that.
Pretending to be civil rights leaders.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, they're sending us harassing messages, tracking us, surveilling us without, and I'll say this, without any reasonable understanding that we're connected to a crime, right? So they are not investigating crimes. They were just investigating us. And the Minnesota Department of Human Rights also said that the amount of time that they spent towards investigating Black elected officials, Black civil rights activists, it was so much, right? But yet it was none whatsoever investigating white supremacists. And I wonder why, because the white supremacists don't need to investigate themselves, do they? When you have an article just came out today about a police officer who was feeding information to white supremacist organizations and the leading to the January 6th attack. So, you don't need to investigate yourself if you're already in the group.
Well, there's a common denominator in this conversation that I want to point out, and that is that, again, thanks to Mike V earlier, he sent a post saying, in regards to our letting felons vote question, he said, Al, in Vermont, people that are incarcerated are all allowed to vote. So that's happening in Vermont.
Illinois, number of states, Iowa.
But he said in Vermont, it's 99% white. Not DC is the same way. I didn't know that. And the connection I'm making is rules that favor white people and rules that can also be turned to disadvantage Black people. And that's what I was hearing from Angela, her word of caution about how we get into understanding the question of forensic analysis as a tool, and how many tools and many policies and practices, while they sound reasonable, are often applied in ways that are different from one population to another population.
Yeah, exactly. And I would also say, I talked about restorative justice earlier. And for me as an individual, it is hard for me, right, to also imagine restorative justice, in the case of like white supremacists as well. But like that is what Minneapolis NAACP also engaged in a restorative justice process with the young man who had driven over folks on I-694, right, in that protest that had happened. And it was a young white man, and we tried to really engage with the community, with the protesters that were there, and that individual around some restorative justice community accountability, his accountability to our community. I mean, it didn't negate that he's still he still has like a legal system that he has to go through, but these are the tough conversations too when we're talking about restorative justice. Is not just when the people that we inherently are compassionate for, but also how can we not throw away anybody to make sure that not just individuals, white supremacists are no longer white supremacists, that they see Black people as humans, that, they take accountability for their actions so much so that, they grow from that. How can we do that? And that's the tricky part. That's the messy part. That's the hard part. That's the part where I'm growing as well. Like I saw white supremacists put away for life. My initial was like, yeah, he should be. But then I had to stop and be like, okay, what does a restorative justice system look like if it is just one-sided? We have to do it in a real way for everybody, right?
I think that discussion has to sort of inform how we even look at what's happened in Memphis with the 5 Black officers that have been charged with the murder of a Black citizen there. Do you think so, Yusuf? What do you think? I mean,
Well,
here's how I look at that. People were complaining that isn't it funny that they were able to bring this action against these officers so quick, charge them, and the implication was that it's because they're Black. My response to that is they did the right thing. It should be done quickly. But what they are doing now is setting a standard, a bar that
Yeah.
should be applied across the board in all circumstances of officer misconduct, and not allow what had been happening in the past, where an item gets postponed and delayed and thought about and studied and researched, and after it fades from public memory, then quiet deals are done and people go on their merry way to continue doing the disservice to the profession and the community that they're supposed to serve. This elevated the potential and the possibility of a city acting quickly, and in doing so, I believe it ought to be held as a standard across the board. Well, WD, what do you think? Yusuf, what do you think?
Well, there's been a national registry created to document these cases of excessive police brutality. And many departments are now using that, because what has occurred in the past, Al, is that when an officer is facing serious scrutiny or the potential for civil or criminal charges, they resign during the investigation. And once they resign, like teachers who resign, the investigation ends because that person is no longer an employee. That's the case with Geronimo Yanez, the officer who was responsible for the death of Philando Castile. Resigned, got a big bonus, left the state, went to San Antonio, joined a police department, and now has come back to Minnesota and wants to go to court to try and force the post board to again license him to become a law enforcement officer in the state of Minnesota. It's absolutely crazy. Absolutely crazy.
Quick question. It's kind of an aside. How safe is Minnesota, or how safe is our country? Again, thanks to one of our viewers, according to the Global Peace Index, which is created by the Institute for Economics and Peace in the U.S., the U.S. ranks 129 in safety. And this kind of counters the argument created about America being a safe place, a safe harbor for everybody. Angela, what do you think?
I'm currently doing work with Jason Soul over, safe cities, safe counties for Black abolitionists, Black activists in the U.S., right? And so I had to ask him, what is safe? What's safety? And so when you ask how safe is Minnesota, how safe is the U.S., safe for who? And then what does safe mean to you? It's a subjective question, especially when safety, there's a lot of white women out here that walk down the street. They don't feel safe just because they see 2 Black guys standing on the street. Okay. They could be in a suit or not, in a hoodie, right? But they don't feel safe. Safe has been weaponized against our community continuously in the creation of laws and the way that they've put away our brothers, our sisters, our fathers, our mothers. So, what's safe? And is that the goal? Or is like well-being and healing soul wounds of a community really a goal? Like, what's the true goal here when safe is so subjective and is so weaponized against us, where you see somebody who's Black or brown and suddenly you're not safe, So let's maybe also let's tangle with this term safety as well.
That reminds me, Angela, I was in Ghana coming down a mountain in a group. I think this was with the stair step group or maybe one after that, but I was so surprised. Must have been 10, 11 at night, dark. And I see 2 white women walking down the side of the road perfectly, having a evening chat and an evening stroll. And so it begs the question, what is safe, what is really safe, and is there another agenda? That agenda being the terrorists, creating a terrorist environment against Black presence, against Black dignity, against Black people. And so that seems to be the societal or the structural systemic posturing that is belied by the reality of seeing, again, two white ladies walking down a hill in the mountains in Ghana. They're not feeling afraid, obviously. And so is there a political agenda about the fear that white people express here? Let me move on. This is a great conversation. Thank you for all being in all the topics we talked about. I want to bring in W.D. Foster Graham, and let's talk about books. W.D. Foster Graham is the book review editor for Insight News, and he's got a book to talk about, and we'll all share our response or questions about that book. W.D. Foster Graham, good afternoon again. What you got for us, brother?
Thanks, Al. Well, for my latest book review, Stephanie Scheider wrote a book called I Think I Like My Natural Hair. And she opened the book with, "Oh, she's pretty for a black girl," and she realized that's an insult. Why couldn't you just say she's pretty? And she like all of us were exposed to the shall we say the belief that if you as a person of color, if you had light skin and you had long straight hair, that automatically valued you. If you had dark skin and you had natural hair, you were less than. Now that wasn't a big deal for her until she was in 4th grade and it challenged her by her coworker, or should I say her classmates, in a very cruel way. But that's been an ongoing issue about this Eurocentric standard of beauty that's supposedly supposed to be the only standard. Now she takes it deeper, but going all the way back to the roots in slavery, when slaveholders would disenfranchise us in any way they could to forget our African roots and heritage, keep us in identity crisis, in fear, and low self-esteem, all of those things. Now she also, and this is just the outward manifestation of the good hair and the bad hair in terms of we internalize that racism. But she also says it's important that we have a sense of who we are, especially in our family. And that's done by sharing the stories, keeping up a strong family narrative.
Is this book aimed at general market or teens or children? Who's the reader for this book?
Well, the reader for this book would be a general market, because she refers to that not only so far as adults, but also with children, because unconsciously, by doing these dichotomies, we are teaching our children that self-hate.
Any comment on the book, on the theme of the book, Yusuf, first of all, and Angela?
Well, I think all of us grew up hearing comments like she has good hair, or he has defiant hair, and I'm reminded that the original hair straightener was lye and sweet potatoes. Okay, and growing up, I had a childhood friend who wanted to straighten his hair, and I was assigned to tighten all the faucets in the house. He claimed he looked in the mirror and saw smoke coming off his head and stuck his head in the toilet. He said it was so hot. And a lot of people have gotten severe burns and done damage to their skin, their scalp. And there was a ditty when I was growing up that said, "Concholine rules the world, not a kink and not a curl. And when your head turns red and bald, Concholine done it all." And Concholine was one of the hair straightening products, along with JLA, Jap, Conch, that people bought and used because they felt it provided a boost to their appearance and made them more attractive and more acceptable in society. So kudos for the author of the book and for WD doing the review, and hopefully more people will do that. And I would remind us that Afro is not a hairstyle. Okay, It's natural. Okay. And God bless Angela, myself, and the rest of us who still have a little hair left and prefer it. So.
Angela, go ahead.
No, I agree. The Crown Act just passed last 2 weeks ago, last week. So the Crown Act, there is real hair discrimination in this country that manifests in jobs, things like that. So we can understand why women or folk might want to, use the chemical straighteners to relax their hair. But there's recently been a number of medical studies that have come out around the connection between relaxers and, health disparities. So breast cancer, cervical cancer, hormonal cancers, there's different impacts that it has, not just physically, where we know like burns. I got a little chemical burn on the back of my head from when I relaxed my hair when I was younger. And also Black women have, psoriasis, I have seborrheic dermatitis, which is a skin condition. So, you do need to be cognizant of that. I'm natural. I am locking my hair. And, I think about this often when I think about good hair is when I had my afro and it was long, people loved it, or my natural hair and it was long, people loved it. But there's an aspect of colorism, of texturism that does still permeate our community of, well, it was long and it was cute and I was a cute young girl, so it worked out. Now I have these budding, locks, and locks have different connotations. So even our different hairstyles, how we wear our hair, they have different connotations as well that are rooted in anti-Blackness. And so that's what we need to attack, is why do we hate these things so much for, our own insecurities. So yeah, like I'm standing here, yeah, my hair might not be cute to a European standard, right? It might not be beautiful in that way, but I find it beautiful. I find it freeing. I find it wonderful, fun to play around with. And I find it a good representation of me. Like with my long natural hair, I loved playing in it. But at some point, you couldn't even see my face. You couldn't, like, people don't even recognize me anymore when I cut it all off to that point. So, maybe I want a hairstyle where people can see me and see my personality more than they can see my hair, too.
Yusuf, I remember sitting over on University Avenue, I think it was University or Payne Avenue, maybe in St. Paul, at the hairstylist shop. Brother named James, I can't think of his last name. His company was called the Mane of the Lion. I don't know if you knew him, brother. Anyway, but my funny story is that when I decided to get a Jerry curl back in the day, right? I'm sitting there under this lye or whatever it is they use to straighten the hair, and it starts to burn and hurts. And I'm saying, you know what? This must be a conspiracy, because I'll bet you that probably I'll be bald one day. And I said, all these brothers out getting their hair straightened through the Jerry curl are going to have a common experience at some time in the future, and we'll see each other and recognize each other because of our bald heads. We know that we damaged our scalps.
Concolene done it all. Concolene done it all.
Yeah. One quick thing I just want to say about the book. The overall message is it's up to us to embrace and learn, embrace all of ourselves and love ourselves.
Thank you.
Good one, good one. Listen, we're about out of time, but thank you, Brother W.D. Foster Graham. Thank you, Ndugu Yusuf and Janie. Thank you, Angela Rose Myers. I want to remind people to join us tomorrow. I won't be here tomorrow, but Dr. Bravada Garrett Oxensanya will be hosting for me tomorrow, and we're continuing the conversation with the wife of the former DC sniper. We've had 2 programs with her already. The question is a question of domestic violence and domestic abuse. And Sister Mildred Muhammad, who's emerged out of her, out of her situation as a major speaker. Well, I'll leave it there. See you tomorrow. I'm Al McFarlane.
Thanks, Al.